So Asia is obviously the most important economic zone in the world now, and dominating that, of course, is China. And China usually has a big placing in the top 1,000 rankings. How has China done this year?
So essentially, there's a bit of a record-breaking performance because for the first time in the history of the top 1,000, amongst the top 5 banks, we have 4 Chinese banks. So ICBC is the first one for the 4th year running, China Construction Bank, the second one for the 3rd year running. And it's quite interesting to see that obviously there's an economic slowdown in China, growing NPLs in the banking sector, and a lot of worries about whether corporates will service this debt. However, Chinese banks have still grown considerably in terms of Tier 1 capital.
All right, but does it seem as if, we've seen the Chinese banks growing year after year. Do you think we've actually reached a peak? In the current cycle, at least?
Well, I have to say that it is quite surprising to see that their performance continues to be strong. It is interesting to know, though, that it is not the only region that is performing in that way, whereas probably 5 years ago you would see China really leaping forward in terms of increases in Tier 1 capital for their banks.
Okay, so what other regions are doing as well, if not better than China then?
So very surprisingly, actually, Japan. So Japanese banks have had a really tough ride in the last few years. There are low net interest margins, low inflation, very low rates. Yeah. The economy is not growing, but actually Japanese banks this year on aggregate in the top 1,000, their Tier 1 capital growth has actually been higher than China. So theirs has been around 13%. Chinese banks has been around 11%.
And is that because they're expanding overseas, or they're taking a more conservative approach and so raising more capital, or what's the reason?
Essentially, Japanese banks now are really bulking up on capital to counter the tough situation they're facing at home. And that is why they're trying to expand overseas, especially in ASEAN. Japanese banks are also some of the few in Asia that have very strong US presence. So they really want to bulk that up as well. And essentially, that's why capital is going up. It is worth noting, though, that because both Chinese and Japanese banks face tough macro situations at home, their profitability is slightly going down at around 4 or 5% on aggregate.
Okay, now let's turn to the other big economy in Asia, which is obviously India. And traditionally India has punched below its weight in banking, hasn't it? Are we seeing any signs of India really getting to grips with its banking system?
So I think this financial year has been quite momentous for India because the regulator finally has forced banks to really unveil the extent of their non-performing loans, some of which was really not known up until this year. This is really hurting some of the public sector banks in the country. However, we're seeing that even Indian banks in our ranking have grown in terms of Tier 1 capital, but it is worth noting that the ones that feature, for example, in our top 25 for Asia remain the strongest and biggest banks in the country. We'll be probably seeing some difficulty in the smaller public sector banks.
All right, now one of the positives has been that the central bank has taken quite a tough line on non-performing assets, but we've just seen the resignation of the central bank governor. Do you think that will have an impact on the restructuring of the Indian banking sector?
I think Rajan really personified the tackling of this problem that very few regulators and public officials took on in the way he has. And I think for that kind of change to happen, you need to have a figure that really pushes this forward, especially in a country like India where the public sector banks and the banking sector as a whole has been quite stagnant and quite comfortable in the past few decades. I think there are a few doubts in terms of whether his good work will continue in the future.
Okay, so a bit of a doubt there. But now let's finish with Taiwan, which you were telling me earlier is a surprising outperformer. So what's been going on in Taiwan?
So essentially, I think the Taiwanese banking sector is one of the most unreported banking sectors in Asia in terms of its performance because the banks are very well capitalized. They're very strong, for example, around renminbi operations. They're full of liquidity and they're really keen to put it to work. So finally, we have a couple of banks featured in our top 25 Asian banks by Tier 1 capital. And we have Mega Bank and CTBC. And essentially, last year they were not present. And what they're doing that really stands out is that they're going abroad in other parts of Asia, and they're really keen to grow, especially because the regulator is pushing them to.
Okay, always good to finish on a positive note. Thanks, Stefania, for that ride around Asia.
Thank you.